Valentine's Day wasn't supposed to be like this. It was supposed to be full of love, sweet gestures, and all that Hallmark crap. Instead, I spent my night at a dingy diner, serving a bunch of lovey-dovey couples who probably couldn't care less about the waitress who handed them their lukewarm coffee. I was exhausted, drained, and when my shift finally ended, all I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and sleep until the world stopped feeling like a bad dream. But tonight, something was different. The streets were too quiet. No laughing couples, no groups of friends heading out to bars. Just the occasional car driving past, its headlights cutting through the thick darkness like a blade. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and quickened my pace, my boots echoing on the sidewalk, the only sound breaking the silence. Then I heard it. A scream. Distant. Almost like it came from a different time, a different world. I froze. It wasn't like the typical noise you hear at night, drunk kids messing around or someone fighting. This was something else. I told myself it was nothing. Probably just the wind or someone playing around. But the scream lingered, crawling under my skin like an itch I couldn't scratch. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. 2 years ago, on this exact night, everything changed. David and Clara, young in love, the kind of couple you'd see in a rom-com, were found dead in their upscale apartment. Stabbed to death, their bodies twisted in the kind of position that made even the toughest cops question what they were seeing. No signs of forced entry. No robbery. No motive. The apartment was locked from the inside like they were waiting for someone. Or maybe they never had a choice. I remember the chills that ran through me when I first heard the news. Not because of the brutality, though that was bad enough. It was the way people talked about it. The way the city felt. Like something was lurking just out of sight. The killer was never caught, and the case slowly faded from the headlines, just another unsolved mystery. But not for me. Every Valentine's Day since I think about it, I can't help it. The image of that blood-stained room, David's lifeless eyes still staring at me from the news reports, haunts me. I wonder sometimes if the killer was even human, or if they were something else. The scream I heard earlier tonight felt like a warning, like history was repeating itself. The streets were quieter now, even though the night was still young. After my shift, the last thing I wanted was to think about the past, especially the case that had never left my mind. But then my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with an unknown number and I hesitated. I didn't recognize the number, but I opened the message anyway. Do you remember David and Clara? They never really left. The words seemed to crawl across the screen and my heart skipped a beat. It was like a cold hand brushed against my spine. I stared at the message trying to process it, but I couldn't. And then I saw it, the broken heart symbol at the end. I pulled my coat tighter around me despite the warmth of the night. There was something suffocating about the message. Something that felt too personal. Too real. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The city felt wrong, too still, too silent. My pulse was racing. My mind was spinning. I shouldn't have read it. But I had to know, what did this message mean? Was someone out there reminding me of the murder that had never been solved? Or was it something worse? I couldn't stop thinking about that message. They never really left. Was it just some sick prank or something worse? The unease gnawed at me, a constant weight pressing down on my chest. I had to know more. I had to face it. The apartment building loomed ahead, shrouded in darkness. Abandoned for years, it still felt as if it had a life of its own, cold and silent but ever present. Locals whispered about it being haunted, a place where shadows never quite left. I pushed open the rusted front door. The hallway stretched out before me, bathed in the dim glow of a flickering light at the far end. The smell of mildew and decay hung heavy in the air. My steps echoed too loudly in the silence, making the place feel even more unnerving. And then I saw it, the door to David and Clara's apartment. It was the same as I remembered, blood-stained, weathered, but untouched by time. I hesitated, my hand hovering just an inch from the cold doorknob. A jolt of icy dread surged through me. I shouldn't be here. But I couldn't stop. I turned the knob. The moment the door creaked open, the air changed. It was as if the very room exhaled and I was sucked in. Something was waiting for me inside, something I couldn't see, but I could feel it. The dread was palpable. I wasn't alone. The moment I stepped inside, the air turned heavy, suffocating. The room was eerily untouched, as if the crime had just happened yesterday. Dust coated the furniture, the wallpaper peeling at the edges, but it felt alive, like the walls had been waiting for someone to return. A cold breeze whispered against my neck. The windows were shut. I swallowed hard, stepping further inside. My footsteps sounded too loud, like they didn't belong. Then the temperature dropped. It wasn't just a chill, it was a bone-deep cold that seeped into my skin. And then I heard it. A whisper. Faint, distant. Help us. I spun around, my pulse hammering, but no one was there. Just empty space. The apartment seemed to stretch and shrink at the same time. I felt lightheaded, disoriented. The walls pulsed. I blinked, and for the briefest moment I saw them. David and Clara. Their faces were twisted in horror, trapped inside the walls. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back, my vision tunneling. The room was warping, reality distorting. I wasn't alone. I was never alone. My hands shook as I rifled through old newspapers in the dark of my apartment. I couldn't stop thinking about those whispers, about the faces of David and Clara, their eyes wide with terror. Every detail of their deaths haunted me. As I skimmed through old articles, something clicked. Each Valentine's Day, a violent death had occurred in this same building. But it wasn't just random. The murders followed a twisted pattern. Always couples, always on the same night, and a broken heart symbol was always left near the scene. I froze, staring at the latest report. The building had a history, an ugly one. In the past, there were rumors of strange rituals, of broken hearts left on the doorsteps of love-stricken souls. The more I dug, the more the pattern became undeniable. This wasn't just a string of random murders. It was a curse, a ritual. Someone, or something, was using Valentine's Day as a twisted reminder of love lost, love betrayed. A lover's vengeance. I couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't just a killer. This was something supernatural. I couldn't let this go on any longer. I had to end it tonight. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood in front of the old apartment building once more. The air was thick with dread, colder than ever before. I pushed open the door. The darkness inside felt suffocating. And then there it was, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Suddenly the temperature dropped. The air crackled and the whispers returned, only louder now. The figure appeared, the twisted face of a lover lost in rage. The spirit of the killer, draped in shadows, slowly emerged, eyes burning with hatred. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed, its voice a low growl. The walls seemed to close in as I fought back with everything I had, tears stinging my eyes, fists clenched. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused. I had to finish this. Finally, with a last desperate push, the spirit shrieked and disappeared, leaving nothing but silence. Or so I thought. "You're never free," it whispered just before I collapsed. I stumbled out of the building, gasping for breath. My body was shaking, my mind still reeling from the battle I had just fought. It was over. I had won. But as I walked down the darkened street, the familiar chill crawled back into my bones. Something was wrong. I turned the corner, and there it was, a broken heart symbol painted crudely on the wall. The same symbol from all the murder scenes. My phone buzzed. I hesitated, then checked the message. "You thought you were free. The cycle never ends." A wave of ice washed over me. I felt the blood drain from my face. The killer had never been defeated. The spirit hadn't been vanquished. It had simply retreated, waiting for the next Valentine's Day. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The cycle was far from over. And neither was I. The terror would return. Chicago's skyline loomed in the distance, bathed in the cold, indifferent glow of streetlights. It was Valentine's Day, but the city, as usual, wore a different face, one that was more accustomed to blood than love. The bitter wind bit at Rachel's skin as she walked down the nearly deserted street. A stark contrast to the lively, romantic atmosphere elsewhere. Here, in the shadow of history, something darker was always brewing. Rachel pulled her collar tighter around her neck, pushing away the unsettling feeling that crept in every February 14th. For the people of this city, Valentine's Day had become something else entirely. Not just a day for lovers, but a day soaked in violence, a day when the past seemed to bleed into the present. The Valentine's Day massacre of 1929 had cast a long shadow, one that seemed to get darker with each passing year. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another gruesome murder had been reported. This time, a couple, both shot in the head in what looked like an execution-style killing. It was too similar to the infamous massacre. As she headed towards the scene, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence. History had a way of repeating itself in this city. And sometimes history didn't die. It just waited for the right moment to come back. The scene was eerily familiar. An upscale apartment in the heart of Chicago, the kind of place where the city's elite would go to forget their troubles. Now it was nothing more than a crime scene. Rachel stood just outside the apartment, her heart beating faster as she took in the gruesome sight. The bodies of a young couple lay sprawled on the floor, their eyes frozen wide open in terror. The blood was still fresh, pooling around them. The same precision, the same chilling sense of execution. This wasn't just another random act of violence. The killer had left their mark. She flashed her badge to the officer at the door, forcing herself to stay calm despite the grim tableau before her. As she stepped into the apartment, a wave of coldness hit her. It wasn't just the winter air, it felt like something ancient, something dark, was lingering in the room. Her eyes went immediately to the floor where the bodies lay. A closer inspection confirmed her suspicion. The execution-style shots to the head, the twisted angle of their necks. But it was the symbol near the bodies that made her skin crawl. A broken heart was scrawled on the wall in what appeared to be blood. Rachel's mind raced. She'd seen this before. The Valentine's Day massacre of 1929 had a similar signature. The killer was not just recreating history, they were reliving it. A flash of movement caught her eye, and for just a moment she thought she saw a figure, dark, shapeless, slip into the shadows of the apartment. But when she turned, there was nothing. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. This was no ordinary case. This was something far darker. The city's history had a way of repeating itself, and this was no coincidence. It was like the killer had been waiting for this day to arrive. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She stared at the broken heart symbol on the wall, still unsettled by how familiar it felt. Every part of her screamed that this wasn't just another random killing, it was a message. The broken heart, the ritualistic precision, the fact that it all happened on Valentine's Day. It wasn't a coincidence. Back in her apartment, she pored over the old case files. The Valentine's Day massacre of 1929, the one everyone had forgotten about. A cold case long gone from public memory. But the more Rachel read, the more it felt like the killer hadn't disappeared. They were still out there waiting. Her phone buzzed, breaking her focus. A text from an unknown number. Do you remember what happened to the couple? The one you couldn't save? Her heart skipped. Who could know about that? Who would? Before she could respond, another message came through. They're still here. You can't escape them. A cold chill crept up her spine as her fingers hovered over the phone. There was no name, no identifier, just these chilling words. Was this from the killer? Or was it something else? Something supernatural? The unanswered question gnawed at her, the weight of fear pressing her chest. Who was the real threat? Rachel sat at her desk, sifting through the thick pile of papers in front of her. The old leather-bound notebook her grandfather had left behind caught her eye. It was filled with detailed notes from years ago, most of it unintelligible, but certain words jumped out at her. Ghostly figures, dark suits, and eerie shadows. These references seemed too specific to ignore. As she flipped through the pages, she realized this wasn't just an investigation into the massacre. It was a deep dive into the supernatural forces that had haunted the case. The more Rachel read, the more unsettled she became. Her grandfather's notes spoke of blurred figures, shadows that hovered in the corners of the crime scenes, vanishing just as quickly as they appeared. The victims had been watched, and the killers, it seemed, were never alone. She could feel her heartbeat quicken as she connected the dots. As if on cue, the room grew unnervingly cold. The lights above flickered once, then twice. A chill ran down her spine, and she could have sworn she heard faint whispers in the air. Her breath became shallow as the sensation of being watched crept over her. The walls felt like they were closing in, and Rachel wasn't sure whether it was the stress of the case or something far darker pulling her into the depths. The shadows were real. The ghosts of the gang members were still out there, lingering, watching, waiting. Rachel's heart thudded in her chest as she stood at the threshold of the old garage. The place where the massacre had happened, where 7 men had been slaughtered. The walls still bore traces of their deaths, a silent testimony to the horror that had unfolded here years ago. As Rachel stepped inside, the air felt unnaturally still, colder than it should have been. Her breath fogged up in front of her face, but it wasn't the cold that made her tremble. It was the heavy silence. Something was watching her. Then, without warning, the first ghostly figure appeared. A man in a torn suit, his face frozen in an expression of terror. He reached out to Rachel, but as he did, his body flickered and twisted as though caught between worlds. The others followed. 7 men, each trapped in their final moments. The room filled with their low, mournful whispers, "Help us!" Their voices overlapping, their words a warning. Each spirit seemed to reach out for her, their eyes pleading for release. The very air was thick with their pain. Suddenly, a dark figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, cloaked in black, his face hidden in darkness. Rachel's breath caught as she saw his cold eyes glint with malevolent purpose. This was the killer, the spirit of the man who had orchestrated the massacre. And now he was coming for her. Rachel's pulse raced as she stumbled backward, her eyes never leaving the cloaked figure. The killer's spirit, tall and menacing, stepped forward, his presence suffocating. The coldness in the room deepened, freezing her to the spot. The spirits of the 7 men hovered around her, their faces twisted in terror, their voices rising in a chorus of silent screams. The air was thick with something darker now, a ritualistic energy, one Rachel couldn't fully comprehend, but she felt it in her bones. The ghostly figure spoke for the first time, his voice a rasp that made her insides crawl. 7 lives, every year until the debt is paid. Rachel blinked, her mind struggling to process his words. It wasn't just a massacre. It was part of a cyclical ritual, a curse. Every year, 7 men, random victims, were sacrificed in this very garage to keep the killer's vengeful spirit alive. As the killer's voice echoed in her mind, Rachel understood. The spirits were never meant to be freed. They were the sacrifices, the price for the killer's immortality. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. She wasn't just dealing with one ghost. She was dealing with the spirit of a serial killer, a man whose wrath had been sustained for years by this deadly recurring ritual. Rachel had to find a way to break the cycle before she became the next sacrifice. The weight of the revelation crashed over Rachel like a tidal wave, but she didn't have time to process it. The killer's spirit lunged at her, its incorporeal hands closing around her throat. She gasped for air, feeling the coldness seeping into her skin, freezing her soul. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, rusted pipe by her side. Desperation surged through her, and with every ounce of strength left in her body, she swung it at the spirit. It passed through the figure's chest, but the shudder it sent through the air was enough. The spirit recoiled for a moment. But then the ghostly figure snarled, its form shifting into something horrifyingly monstrous, a grotesque mixture of man and nightmare. Rachel's heart raced. She wasn't fighting just any ghost. She was fighting something ancient, something that should not exist. In that moment, Rachel understood that survival wasn't just about fighting the killer's spirit, it was about breaking the curse. She had to stop the ritual, or die trying. Rachel stumbled out of the building, her legs shaking, her body covered in cold sweat. The fight had taken everything from her, and her heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. The ghostly presence had been destroyed, or so she thought. Her breath caught in her throat as she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure still looming in the darkness. But the streets were empty. For a fleeting moment she felt relief. The night was quiet, too quiet. As Rachel walked toward her car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She took it out, hands trembling. The screen was black, save for one chilling message. You thought you were free. The cycle never ends. Her eyes widened in disbelief. She turned, looking for any sign of the supernatural force, but there was nothing, except the broken heart symbol, spray-painted on a nearby wall. Rachel's pulse quickened. The nightmare was far from over. She wasn't free. No one ever was. Amelia and Ethan arrived at Lover's Bridge just after dinner, their hearts light and full of love. The night was crisp, the kind of cold that nipped at your cheeks but felt refreshing in the soft mist that rolled across the river. Lanterns flickered along the bridge, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched across the wooden planks. The air smelled faintly of water, and the distant sound of waves lapping against the bank added to the bridge's old-world charm. It was Valentine's Day, and Charleston was quieter than usual. Most couples had long gone, retreating to warm homes or cozy restaurants. The bridge felt almost deserted, save for the two of them. They walked hand in hand, exchanging soft smiles and whispered words. Ethan joked about how cheesy the night was, but Amelia didn't mind. Everything felt perfect. They paused midway across, gazing at the river below, the water reflecting the stars. She breathed in deeply, feeling the chill of the night wrap around them. It's so peaceful, she said, but something in her voice betrayed a slight unease. Don't start, Amelia, Ethan teased with a smile. It's just a bridge. A romantic one at that. But Amelia couldn't shake the feeling. The wind picked up, and the shadows seemed deeper than before. The fog thickened as they continued their stroll across the bridge, their footsteps echoing in the quiet night. The romantic atmosphere shifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. Even the sound of the river seemed muffled, swallowed by the dense mist that enveloped them. Amelia leaned against the cold iron railing, looking out over the water, but her peace was short-lived. In the distance, near the far end of the bridge, a shadow moved. At first she thought it was just the fog playing tricks, but the figure stood still, unmoving for a moment. Then it swayed slightly. Her heart skipped. The figure was hunched, its body twisted in a way that didn't seem natural. She squinted, trying to make sense of it, but the figure didn't resemble any ordinary person. Ethan, do you see that? Amelia whispered, her voice shaking slightly. Ethan, distracted by his phone, glanced up and shrugged. It's probably just someone out for a walk. Don't worry. But Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone anymore. The fog was growing heavier now, obscuring the view, making everything seem unreal. Amelia's nerves were frayed. She felt the cold air biting at her skin, but it wasn't just the chill of the night. It was something else, something that made her skin crawl. They reached the middle of the bridge, the quiet stretching on, almost suffocating. Amelia glanced over her shoulder again, her breath catching in her throat. The figure was gone. Didn't you see it? She asked, her voice trembling. It was just there. Ethan sighed, trying to reassure her. You're imagining things. It's just the fog, okay? But Amelia's heart didn't settle. She couldn't shake the sensation that they were being watched. The footsteps they had heard earlier, quiet but growing louder, seemed to come from nowhere. She looked back again, but the figure wasn't there. A flicker of movement caught her eye from the corner, and the hairs on her neck stood on end. She couldn't deny it now, something was following them. Ethan, we need to leave. Now. The mist had grown thicker, almost suffocating, wrapping itself around Amelia and Ethan like a dark shroud. The night had become oppressive, each breath a struggle against the damp air. As they neared the end of the bridge, a sense of dread settled heavily between them. Then through the dense fog a figure emerged. Amelia froze, her pulse thundering in her ears. The figure stood in front of them, blocking their way, its body twisted and deformed. Its skin, gray and stretched thin, clung to its bones. The face, if it could even be called that, was a grotesque mask of hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It made no sound, but its presence seemed to fill the space with an overwhelming weight, as though the air itself had turned heavy. Ethan took a step forward, trying to be brave, his voice barely above a whisper. What is that? The figure didn't move at first, but then with an unnatural jerky motion, it lunged toward them. Before Ethan could react, It vanished into the mist, leaving only the echo of heavy, labored breathing behind. Amelia screamed, grabbing Ethan's arm, pulling him away from the spot. "We need to get out of here now." But the fog was too thick. They were trapped. Amelia and Ethan raced toward the end of the bridge, but with each step, the fog seemed to stretch further into the night, disorienting them. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the mist, but there was no sign of the world beyond. It felt like they were walking in circles, the same cold emptiness surrounding them with every turn. Amelia's heart pounded, but she tried to calm herself. "We need to stay calm. Just find the way out," she urged. Ethan looked at her, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know, Amelia. Something's wrong. This isn't just a normal ghost story." "Yeah, I think you're right," Amelia murmured, her mind racing. Ethan hesitated, then recalled something, a half-remembered story he'd once heard. "This bridge, there's an old legend. Every Valentine's Day, couples disappear. It's the spirit of a lover who killed themselves in the river. They say it hunts anyone who dares to come here, especially couples." A shiver ran down their spines as they realized the truth. The figure wasn't a ghost, it was something worse. Something more dangerous. And they were the next targets. The fog had thickened so much that it felt like a suffocating blanket. Amelia and Ethan stood at the center of the bridge, helpless. There was no way off. No way out. The distant sound of the river rushing below was drowned out by the deafening silence around them. Then, without warning, the figure appeared again. This time, it wasn't lurking in the shadows. It was right in front of them, its grotesque form looming large. Its eyes glowed with malice, its twisted grin almost seemed to stretch across its face like a predator about to feast. Amelia gasped, stumbling back. "Ethan, we have to get out of here." But Ethan stood his ground, trembling with fear but trying to shield her. "We need to fight back." The figure moved closer, its jerky, unnatural movements making Amelia's skin crawl. She saw the way it was feeding off their fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. Ethan swung a piece of wood from the bridge's railing, striking the figure across the chest. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that sent waves of panic through their bodies. The figure's body seemed to ripple, like it was made of smoke rather than flesh. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she realized the horrifying truth. They were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The fog was now so thick, it was almost impossible to tell where the bridge ended and the river began. Amelia and Ethan stood frozen in place, both desperate for an escape but too terrified to move. The figure, the thing that had been stalking them, was still there, its presence oppressive, smothering the very air around them. Every breath felt labored, suffocated by the sheer weight of the nightmare they were trapped in. And then it spoke. Its voice was like gravel being dragged across metal, grating, deep, and full of an unnatural malice. "You think you're safe? You think you can escape me?" Amelia's heart skipped a beat. The thing wasn't just a ghost, it was something far worse, something ancient and filled with a rage beyond comprehension. The figure's form began to distort further, becoming less human, more a writhing mass of anger and jealousy. "I am the manifestation of every broken heart, every unspoken word, every betrayed lover who died in this place. You were foolish to come here tonight. You should never have come to Lover's Bridge." Ethan's face drained of color, and his grip on Amelia tightened. But in that moment, something in Amelia snapped. The terror, the panic, they didn't matter anymore. Survival did. Without thinking, she grabbed a jagged piece of the bridge railing, swinging it with every ounce of strength she had. The metal hit the figure with a sickening thud, and for the first time, the creature seemed to recoil. The air around them shimmered, the distorted form of the figure fracturing, and in that moment of chaos, Amelia and Ethan bolted toward the end of the bridge, gasping for air. They didn't look back. The mist seemed to part before them, as if the bridge itself was finally allowing them to leave. But even as they ran, the heavy sense of dread lingered in the air. The figure had vanished, but the feeling that something was watching them remained. The curse of Lover's Bridge might not be over,